For this unit, we will discuss how to apply human rights and gender equality principles to evaluation use and dissemination. My name is Kirsten Zeiter, and I'm working as an intern with the UN Women Independent Evaluation Office based here in New York City. I'm currently studying for my master's degree in international affairs at the Fletcher School, where I'm focusing on gender, policy, and monitoring and evaluation. I'm excited to be able to present this unit for you today. So our discussion will cover four main topics. First, the evaluation report. Second, promoting evaluation use of that report. Third, the management response to the evaluation. And finally, evaluation dissemination to a wider audience. So diving right into our first topic, the evaluation report. So imagine that an evaluation you've just managed has just been completed. A great deal of time, resources, and staff has all been invested into this, and you've got a number of important findings and recommendations. The task before you now, of course, is to determine how to develop a report that captures all of the important elements of the evaluation in a way that is still clear and accessible to the users of the report. Plus, an evaluation report can be a really great way to reassert the importance of addressing human rights and gender equality. But with all of the components that are expected to be included in the evaluation report, and considering the fact that reports are already very long, you might be wondering, how will it be possible to add another element, human rights and gender equality dimensions, to an already very weighty report? The UNEG standards tell us that the evaluation report should indicate the extent to which gender issues and relevant human rights considerations were incorporated. But what does that actually look like in practice? What is the best way to go about incorporating human rights and gender equality into an evaluation report in a clear and accessible way? These are the questions that we intend to answer here today. So first, what are the key human rights and gender equality dimensions that should be included in the report? What it really comes down to is describing how the program, or whatever the evaluand may be, was or was not gender and human rights responsive. To make that a bit more specific, here are some key things recommended by the guidance that the report should specify. These are all informed by the basics of incorporating human rights and gender equality considerations in programming, which we covered in Unit 1. First, were gender issues implemented in the cross-cutting theme in the program, and did it give sufficient attention to promote gender equality and gender sensitivity? Next, were human rights gaps identified and addressed in the program? Did the program pay attention to the effects on women and marginalized groups? Was it informed by any human rights treaties or instruments? To what extent did the program identify the relevant human rights claims and obligations involved? And finally, how did the program monitor and view results within a rights framework? Again, all of this comes down to describing the various human rights and gender responsive elements that were incorporated into the program being evaluated. Of course, how much human rights and gender equality considerations are included in the report itself will depend directly on the amount of attention they received during the intervention as well as during the evaluation process. For example, a real-time evaluation of an emergency situation, which lasted only 2 weeks and had limited access to the affected population. It may only be able to highlight some key issues such as protection and gender equality without undertaking a full human rights and gender equality analysis. And this is fine. What's important is that the report identifies the low level of resources that were dedicated and describe the rationale for this choice. Okay, you know what human rights and gender equality dimensions to include in the report. The question now is how to present all of this new information within the report in a way that makes sense to the user. One common question is whether to include the human rights and gender equality as a standalone section, so as to give them due prominence and attention, or whether to integrate them throughout the other sections of the report to demonstrate how they are relevant for all areas of the evaluation. We know that the UNEG guidance tells us that specific section is the approach that should be adopted. However, highlighting the implications for human rights and gender equality under each section of the report can also be a good alternative or an addition. So let's take a look at how that could be done. Based on the UNEG standards for the evaluation report content, here's a brief discussion of some human rights and gender equality considerations that could be included in each section. The main idea here is that each section should include a discussion of what role human rights and gender equality play in that specific aspect of the evaluation. For a full breakdown of how to highlight these implications in each section, please download the resource Content and Standards for Evaluation Report. So first, for the section describing the program or object of the evaluation, the main idea is to describe the extent to which human rights and gender equality were addressed by the intervention itself. For example, do the logic model and results chain refer to these issues? Were there resources dedicated in the program to human rights and gender equality? what stakeholder groups were engaged in the intervention, and which may have been left out. While these things may be obvious for interventions explicitly focused on human rights and gender equality, it may require closer analysis for programs where gender and human rights were not the primary area of focus. But the report should still identify any specific steps taken in the program to address human rights and gender equality, even and perhaps especially for programs where these issues were not the main focus. Next, for the section of the report describing the evaluation purpose, objectives, and scope. This should describe what human rights and gender equality considerations were included in these elements of the evaluation itself. Any specific criteria, evaluation questions related to human rights and gender equality should be included here, as well as a discussion of the evaluability of these in the intervention. Of course, inclusion of these elements, again, depends on the extent to which human rights and gender equality were in fact integrated into the design and implementation of the evaluation from the beginning. Next, for the methodology section, you should address whether there were any data collection methods designed to address human rights and gender equality issues. In essence, this section addresses the question, what was the level of inclusion of different stakeholders in the evaluation methodology, particularly women and those who are marginalized or discriminated against? When describing findings, be sure to describe any specific findings on human rights and gender equality related criteria, as well as any evidence related to them, of course. This section should also address any gaps or limitations to addressing human rights and gender equality, and any unanticipated effects of the intervention that may have been had on those issues, as well as factors found to facilitate or hinder success in the area of human rights and gender equality. For the section on evaluation conclusions, the report should include any insights or lessons pertaining to human rights and gender equality, including the strengths and weaknesses of the program in this regard. The conclusion should also reflect a meaningful consideration of the diversity of perspectives in the various stakeholder groups. Next, in providing evaluation recommendations, describe any specific recommendations addressing human rights and gender equality issues, being sure to include the target group for the recommendation and the priorities for action. For evaluations of interventions where the main focus is on these areas, most recommendations will of course focus on human rights and gender equality. But for evaluations of other interventions, it's important that evaluators take deliberate steps to integrate human rights and gender equality throughout the evaluation process, which will help with the process of making these recommendations. And finally, a standalone section on gender and human rights should be included. All of the elements to be included in this section are immediately, of course, relevant for human rights and gender equality responsiveness, and thus we don't really need to discuss the section further here. So let's imagine now that the evaluation report is ready. It's been drafted, commented on, redrafted, negotiated, and eventually finalized, representing the culmination of months of work by the evaluation team. The report has been crafted to be clear and accessible, and great care has been taken to integrate human rights and gender equality into the report itself. The task before the evaluation manager now, of course, is how to make sure this report and the evaluation itself, by extension, is actually used. That is a subject we will move to next. We'll first discuss the importance of evaluation use from a human rights and gender equality perspective. Then we'll discuss the role of the management response and follow-up process in ensuring evaluation use. And finally, we'll discuss factors that contribute to evaluation use. First, the impact of evaluation exercise is determined by how much the new knowledge is actually used by decision makers and stakeholders. And as we know, effective evaluation can be a powerful tool to promote organizational learning, change, and accountability. The last thing we want as evaluators is for the report to be put on a shelf somewhere and never meaningfully utilized. But the question always is, how can we get better at promotion of evaluation use? And what are the implications of human rights and gender equality on evaluation use? The guidance identifies two areas of focus for increasing evaluation use: the management response and the evaluation dissemination. We'll discuss each of those in detail in a few minutes, but for now, let's discuss how evaluation managers can create an enabling environment for strong evaluation use more generally. Evaluators can do this by presenting recommendations that are clear, actionable, and prioritized, especially on human rights and gender equality issues. And even if no human rights or gender equality specific recommendations were made, evaluation managers can still encourage management to respond on the human rights and gender equality issues raised elsewhere in the evaluation report. Evaluation managers can also play an important role in shaping the response process around principles of inclusiveness and participation, accountability, transparency, non-discrimination, and empowerment. So UNEG has identified 3 factors that aid effective evaluation use, especially for incorporating human rights and gender equality principles. First, involving internal and external stakeholders. Second, quality evaluation recommendations. And third, evaluation credibility. So we'll now discuss each one briefly. The first factor that contributes to effective evaluation use is involving internal and external stakeholders. It's fundamental for evaluation use that the primary audience feels ownership of the evaluation and commitment to its recommendations. This audience could be intervention staff, partners, rights holders, duty bearers, etc. A sense of ownership comes from the users being actively involved in decision-making throughout the evaluation process. This leads to greater understanding of the evaluation itself, which increases probability of its use. Plus, a sense of ownership is useful for promoting stakeholders' active involvement in the monitoring and implementation of the recommendations. As has been emphasized throughout this training, meaningful engagement of stakeholders, particularly women and marginalized groups, is a core principle of the human rights-based approach and gender equality mainstreaming. If the evaluation has incorporated human rights and gender equality principles throughout the process already, the conditions for stakeholder involvement here should already be in place. Now, in an ideal world, the human rights and gender equality principles would have been incorporated into the evaluation from start to finish. We know, however, that this doesn't always happen. So what should you do at this stage if the evaluation process was not inclusive and participative to begin with? The guidance tells us that a good evaluation use strategy becomes even more critical in cases where human rights and gender equality were not present in the evaluation process. There are some steps that can be taken in the use stage that can foster some critical, albeit late, collaboration with evaluation users and other stakeholders. For example, the target audience can be identified as early as possible in order to give those stakeholders sufficient time to prepare their input. Specific evaluation products that meet the needs of the target audience should also be developed to ensure that the stakeholders can be informed about the evaluation and perhaps give some additional views that were not captured in the evaluation process. Taking these steps not only upholds human rights and gender equality principles, but it also paves the way for achieving the changes recommended by the evaluation. The second factor that contributes to effective evaluation use is quality evaluation recommendations. Quality recommendations are relevant and actionable, include a target group for each recommendation, and include priorities for action. It is critical that the recommendations are accessible to a variety of target audiences, which requires careful consideration of the evaluation's human rights and gender equality dimensions. The third factor that facilitates evaluation use is evaluation credibility. In short, if an evaluation is not considered to be credible, it will most likely not be used. This is even more essential when tackling sensitive political and social issues, as are typically involved in human rights and gender equality work. Credibility can be increased through validation of results and participatory dissemination, both of which, again, should involve key stakeholder groups to foster ownership and buy-in. There are some specific human rights and gender equality considerations for credibility. Human rights and gender equality evaluations might foster a change in ideas, new awareness, and understanding of an issue. They may transform relationships among stakeholders, empower new communities, and reframe decision-making processes, and provide justification for political action or inaction. They often consider political and social factors or address power imbalances. Thus, evaluators and the evaluation manager need to be aware from the very beginning to the end of the process that some evaluation findings and recommendations might meet resistance or be questioned, and anticipate their response. It is in this way that evaluation credibility takes on an even more critical role for human rights and gender equality focused evaluations, in order to ensure that the important, though perhaps challenging, findings are taken seriously and then utilized. In sum, the evaluation process should not only be as transparent and rigorous and participatory as possible, but human rights and gender equality evaluations also require an even greater consideration of political dimensions, including in planning their dissemination and use, to be sure that entrenched patterns of discrimination are not reinforced. So following our discussion of the basic factors that contribute to evaluation use more generally, let's now discuss the management response itself more specifically. A management response mechanism should identify practical actions, establish clear responsibilities, and outline a time frame for completion. Bringing the human rights and gender equality piece into the picture, evaluation managers need to ensure that the evaluation follow-up responds to the specific recommendations addressing human rights and gender equality, and that it incorporates human rights and gender equality approaches. It's also important to consider that non-human rights and gender equality recommendations can still be supportive of and impact positively on human rights and gender equality outcomes. Given that human rights and gender equality often still need to be strengthened in the UN context, it's particularly important to ensure allocation of responsibility and resources for following up on recommendations related to these two themes. But what about interventions that did not succeed in integrating human rights and gender equality into their program design? In these cases, the evaluation has the opportunity to recommend that design processes should include these elements in the future, both for the evaluand program and for future programs. Thus, one recommendation has a strong potential to help further institutionalize human rights and gender equality into the design process within an organization broadly. You might be thinking, yeah, all of this advice is really great, but how can one actually go about ensuring the management response does all of these things? The management response preparation will need to consider the human rights and gender equality dimensions from three different perspectives: participation in the discussions, implementation of human rights and gender equality specific recommendations, and observation of the human rights and gender equality dimensions in other recommendations. We'll now explore each one of those in more detail. First, participation in the discussions. Following the principles of participation and inclusion, the management response discussion should be an inclusive process informed by the stakeholder analysis. This will be critical to ensure the management response is relevant and taken seriously. Unless there is acceptance of the evaluation report and its recommendations, the potential for follow-up on action will be very limited. Next, regarding implementation of human rights and gender equality specific recommendations. Response to these recommendations should be prioritized, and resources and responsibilities need to be clearly articulated to ensure they're addressed. The action plans in these recommendations should also be monitored closely. It's also important to note here that other actors are involved as well. You have CSOs, national governments, and donors who could all have a central role in implementing human rights and gender equality related recommendations. Finally, what should be done to ensure recognition of the human rights and gender equality dimensions in other recommendations? This point is especially relevant for evaluations of programs that don't have an explicit focus on these issues already. So let's think about an example. If an agreed action on a recommendation is to partner with an NGO to provide training to intervention participants, what are the human rights and gender equality dimensions that could be considered? First, it may be important that the NGO selected has a proven track record of working with women or marginalized groups in order to not further contribute to exclusion and discrimination. Particular attention could also be paid to ensure the right stakeholders groups are targeted in the training, specifically that it doesn't overlook including both men and women and members of marginalized groups. There can also be concrete plans to invest time and resources to reach women and marginalized groups as a new target audience for the training. This point is especially relevant for evaluations of programs that don't already have an explicit human rights and gender equality focus. Okay, so let's say now that the management response has taken all three of these dimensions into account. How can you guarantee there'll be meaningful follow-up? Here are a couple of things you'll need. First, accountability mechanisms must be in place. Second, those have to have adequate resources allocated to them. Third, you should develop user-friendly tools for clear tracking and systematic follow-up. Next, utilize both formal and informal processes to verify that evaluation-based learning takes place. For example, management responses can be published in public databases, and in this forum, management can also report on the status of implementation. Specific tasks or checklists regarding human rights and gender equality issues can also be included in these tools. And this use of the sort of public databases for evaluation reports and management responses are increasingly common among UN entities, the OECD, and the World Bank. Some examples: UNDP and UN Women have Evaluation Resource Center and Global Accountability and Tracking of Evaluation Use, or GATE, both of which are online and are searchable by different categories such as fostering democratic governance or gender mainstreaming. UNICEF also has an evaluation database, which includes a category for child rights, gender equity, and also several categories for child protection. And the UNFPA evaluation database is searchable by keyword, including gender, women and children's rights, and the database includes corresponding management responses. What's next? We've got our evaluation report, our management response mechanisms in place, and now we want to make the learnings of the evaluation process accessible to a broader audience. A discussion of a dissemination strategy, specifically how it relates to human rights and gender equality issues, is our next and last topic of this unit. So the main idea for a dissemination strategy is this. It should effectively distribute evaluation findings and recommendations in the most accessible, transparent, and inclusive way possible. The findings and recommendations should be made available to a wide audience that extends beyond those involved in the intervention. This means that evaluations should be presented in a manner that is easily understood by the target audiences without too much jargon and technical evaluation language. So getting more specific, a successful human rights and gender equality responsive dissemination strategy should do three things. First, based on the stakeholder analysis, it should identify and involve the direct users of the evaluation. Second, it should identify other potential users who may benefit from the evaluation findings. These could be, for example, international and national human rights groups, women's rights and gender equality groups, and other civil society organizations, human rights duty bearers not directly involved in the project, and evaluation networks. Third, a human rights and gender equality responsive dissemination strategy should provide barrier-free access to the evaluation products. So let's look at an example of a successful dissemination strategy. The UN Women's Sabea program did a number of things we can learn from related both to engaging stakeholders and targeted dissemination. First, to better engage stakeholders, the evaluation of the Sabea program organized a stakeholder meeting in the region with representatives of various groups, including program participants, donor representatives, UN and national officials, and local and international CSOs. Next, they used different tools during that stakeholder meeting. For example, they had presentations, discussions, even a movie, and an award ceremony, which appealed to different audiences. And finally, they used the results of that discussion in the stakeholder meeting to inform the management response. Next, they also did some great things for targeted dissemination. Dissemination planning should identify a diversity of channels and formats that reach different audiences, for example, through things like imagery, theater, poetry, or music. The Sabea program did the following things, and they can be thought of as a sort of checklist for an evaluation launch. Define talking points and messaging. Coordinate with the communications office. Partner with CSOs for a launch event to increase the visibility. Publish press releases. Have the relevant translations, and advance report distribution. Engage social media. Post highlights and success stories on blogs and the agency website. And you could disseminate through things like the UN Women website, UNDP Evaluation Resource Center, and UN Women Gender Equality Evaluation Portal. So before we finish up the unit, there's one final aspect of dissemination we should address, a feedback and lessons learned mechanism. It's important to measure the effectiveness of the dissemination strategy, the quality of evaluation products, and the impact. This will help gauge the extent to which evaluation information has actually been useful and applied to decision making. Information should also be gathered at this stage on rights holders' participation in the follow-up process. All right, that's it for Unit 9. Thanks so much for viewing, and be sure to click the link on the following page for additional resources and reading material related to the topic of evaluation use.